Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to ForgottenWeapons.com. This is what would normally be a supporter-exclusive book review video. I do this once a week for those folks who choose to support Forgotten Weapons directly on Utreon or Patreon or Floatplane. And I figured I'd publish this one to everybody just to remind you guys that I have this sort of cool content for those of you who are interested in supporting the channel directly. At any rate, I recently had the chance to visit the Czech Republic and visited CZ and got a bunch of cool content. A little bit of it has posted already, but there's a whole bunch more coming. And one of the other things that I got to do while I was in the country was spend some time in Prague and visit Prague Castle. Got to talk to some of the Prague Castle guards. Very cool people, very hospitable. If you're watching this, I really appreciate the tour. And one of the things that they sent me away with was a copy of this book, which I had not been aware of. Well, I hadn't been aware of its existence. I am familiar with the subject. This is Assassination, Operation Anthropoid, 1941 to 1942. And it's been the subject, this story has been the subject of no less than 6 films. The most recent one, and by far the best, I think, was in 2016, an outstanding movie entitled Anthropoid, which is, as a side note, an absolutely terrible name for the movie. It's an accurate name, it's an appropriate name, but it sure does nothing to convey, unless you already know what the movie's about, that title tells you nothing about it. That was basically the randomly selected code word for the operation to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. So let me back up a step or 2 or 3 here. Germany essentially annexed Czechoslovakia on the eve of World War II, and the Czechs were not, and the Slovaks were not particularly happy about this turn of affairs. This was done really without their, against their will. The rest of Western Allied Europe essentially handed Czechoslovakia to Germany in a hope that it would avoid war, which it ultimately didn't. Now, there was initially a pretty robust Czechoslovakian resistance underground movement, and unfortunately for them, the Gestapo did an extremely good job rooting out and destroying that resistance movement. And so this is largely a really tragic story. At the same time, Czechoslovakia would be the site of really the only high-level assassination of a Nazi official, and that was Reinhard Heydrich, who was brought in to essentially oversee the destruction of the Czech resistance, Czechoslovak resistance. I need to keep including the Slovaks because they were part of this country and they're relevant. At any rate, this resistance movement was supplemented, was helped out by the British Special Operations Executive, who trained a bunch of Czech and Slovak escapees, refugees, essentially. Those who, when the Germans took over, decided to take refuge elsewhere in Europe, and there were a number of Czechoslovakian units that were fighting on the Allied side. Well, some of these guys joined British Special Operations and trained to be agents to be dropped back into Czechoslovakia to aid the underground. And most of this work was communications. They would drop in with radio gear to establish communications between Czechoslovak resistance cells and British High Command, just to coordinate and plan things out. Well, one of the missions that was decided that they would undertake was the assassination of Heydrich. And this is actually a really controversial, even at the time, this was a really controversial and debated thing. On the one hand, Heydrich was a truly evil person and responsible for some really horrible atrocities in Czechoslovakia. On the other hand, it was pretty well recognized that assassinating him would bring some awful retribution from the Nazi government, from the Gestapo. They were big fans of collective punishment, and it was extremely predictable that if the commander of the Nazi regime in Czechoslovakia were assassinated in Czechoslovakia, there would be a lot of dead Czechs and Slovaks, whether they had anything to do with it or not. So the film adaptation of this, as far as I can tell, the 2016 film is really quite accurate in portraying, in particular, 2 main paratroopers who were tasked with this specific assassination. They were trained in the UK. They dropped back into Czechoslovakia, and the movie picks up with them dropping back into the country. It took them a while to work up a plan, to establish connections with the resistance, what was left of the resistance at that point. The cast of characters in the movie is a little bit scaled down from the actual historical people who were involved, kind of just for the sake of clarity and for putting a complicated story into a simple under 2-hour movie. The one thing that the movie does that I'm not sure about really is it introduces essentially a pair of love interests for these two paratroopers. And I don't see any reference to that in the historical record here. Now, I haven't dug into any really serious historical books about this event, so it's possible that these two women, were real. In the film, they're portrayed as essentially both compatriots. There were women in the resistance, and what seems very realistic to me, they made it a lot less suspicious for these two young fighting age men to be in the city walking around. It's a lot less suspicious if they're doing so with a presumably wife with them than if they're walking around on their own or just the two of them. At any rate, beyond that element, the movie, as far as I can tell, portrays the facts of this event very effectively, very factually. So anyway, to skip forward, I'll give you a few spoilers here. They go to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich while he is transiting between his residence and Prague Castle in a car. They find a very sharp corner where he has to slow down. And the plan is one of these guys is essentially going to jump out in front of the car with a Sten gun and hose it down with fire. There is a second guy who is on watch who is also armed with a couple of sort of home-modified anti-tank grenades. Well, the one guy jumps out in front of the car and whips out a Sten gun, and it completely fails to fire. It's interesting that just recently, in the last couple of years, it's become, the archive material has become available that shows that it was, in fact, a bad magazine. It was a failure of the magazine in his Sten gun that led to this plan going badly right from the start. Well, the second paratrooper is able to chuck a grenade at the car. It detonates, but it hits they tried to throw it into the car. Instead, they hit the outside on the rear fender. It blows up. Heydrich jumps out pissed and draws his service pistol and starts shooting at these guys. And essentially, they flee the scene, thinking that the assassination has been a complete failure, and now they're well and truly screwed, because now there's going to be retribution, and they didn't actually accomplish the mission. Well, it turns out shrapnel from the car interior, in fact, hit Heydrich, and he dies several days later of infections. So they were successful in assassinating him. There is, as expected, a tremendous German Nazi retaliation, and the paratroopers end up taking refuge in a church in Prague, along with 5 other paratroopers from other missions. These were guys who were set up for communications, other missions for the resistance. And the plan is to try and get them all out of Prague. Well, they have to lay low until they can figure out a way to get out. They take refuge in this church. They are betrayed by a traitor. The SS finds the church, surrounds it, and about a 6-hour gun battle ensues, in which these guys, who are armed with essentially handguns and a couple of Sten guns, manage to hold off the SS with everything up to and including MG-34s for like 6 hours. Ultimately, not surprisingly, unfortunately, they all end up dead. And retribution continues. It's an extremely heroic story. Some of the damage to the church was deliberately left intact, and there's a memorial plaque there today, which is a very moving sight to see. And the reason that I'm doing this whole video now to bring this full circle is this book, which was actually printed by the Czech Ministry of Defense and is an absolute smorgasbord of original first-hand documentation and artifacts and photos and all sorts of intimate detail about all of the people who were involved in both Operation Anthropoid and the other SOE Czechoslovakian underground resistance missions. And as far as I can tell, the book itself is not available for sale. I found, at the time of this filming, I found one copy from some random seller on Amazon. However, oh, and the back of the book, actually in here, it says at the very end, in sort of all of the contributor credits, copying, translating, duplicating without publisher's consent is prohibited, not for sale. So I'm not sure if you can actually buy this at Prague Castle. I didn't see it in their gift shop, and I didn't think to ask the folks I was with at the time because I didn't realize that it wasn't available. However, while I was searching for it, I did realize that the Czech Ministry of Defense has this available as a free PDF on their website, which is super cool. So you probably can't buy a physical copy of it, but you can just download it and read it for free to your heart's content. So I have a link in the description text to this in PDF, which is a really cool, it's a really excellent read on its own, a really good overview of what was happening with the Czechoslovakian resistance during this time period and how Anthropoid factored into it. It is ultimately a tragic tale. Virtually everyone involved died at the hands of the Gestapo. There were only a couple of the families that harbored some of these resistance group members even survived. Most of the families that they were staying with were found one way or another and all killed. But you should definitely check out the movie if you're interested in this story. It is an extremely well done film. I think it's extremely well acted. It's very realistically done. Not to get overly technical about it, but the gunfight at the end is extremely well done, both historically accurate and technically accurate. And you have a really good companion volume to go along with it. So this has gone quite a lot longer than I planned it to. Normally this sort of video is just a simple book review for those of you who are building your own firearms reference libraries, but this was too cool of a piece for me not to talk about and to show to you guys, and especially the fact that it's available for free. So hopefully you'll check this out, both the movie and the book. And if you would like more of this content, please feel free to subscribe to Forgotten Weapons, either at Patreon or at Utreon or on Floatplane. That will support the channel directly and help allow me to go out and do more cool gun videos. Thanks for watching.